In 2025, one of the most powerful names in technology stopped being feared. Intel, the company that once controlled the heartbeat of the digital world, was suddenly fighting for relevance. Its stock had collapsed by more than 50% from its peak. Tens of thousands of employees were gone. And while the world was drowning in an AI gold rush, Intel was standing on the sidelines, watching others get rich. Hey, this was not a startup failure. This was not a bad quarter. This was the slow implosion of a trillion-dollar legacy, finally exposed. For decades, Intel didn't just make chips. It decided who won, who lost, and what the future looked like. Then, almost quietly, that power disappeared. No dramatic bankruptcy, no single fatal mistake, just a series of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, till they shattered an empire that once defined Silicon Valley itself. This is the story of how the most dominant chip maker on Earth lost the future, and how a corporate giant collapsed without ever realizing it was already too late. Before the collapse, before the doubt, before the headlines turned hostile, Intel was not just a technology company. It was the foundation of modern computing. Founded in 1968 in California, Intel didn't merely participate in the digital revolution, it engineered it. When the personal computer era was born, Intel's processors became its nervous system. Every beep at startup, every spreadsheet opened, every email sent, all of it ran on Intel Silicon. By the 1990s, Intel was unstoppable. The launch of the Pentium processor turned raw engineering into cultural dominance. Intel Inside wasn't marketing, it was a seal of legitimacy. If a computer didn't have Intel Inside, it didn't matter. PC manufacturers depended on Intel. Software companies optimized for Intel. Entire industries waited for Intel's roadmap before making decisions. At its peak, Intel controlled more than 80% of the global CPU market. Its profit margins were the envy of Silicon Valley. Its fabs were the most advanced on Earth, and its engineers were treated like elite scientists, not employees. Intel didn't chase trends. Trends followed Intel. While competitors struggled to survive, Intel dictated the pace of innovation. Tick, then talk. Every 2 years, faster, smaller, more powerful. Moore's Law wasn't a theory inside Intel. It was a promise. By the early 2000s, Intel had become more than a company. It was an institution, a gatekeeper. A quiet empire whose power was so absolute it no longer needed to prove itself. And that confidence, that unshakable belief in its own inevitability, would become the most dangerous asset Intel ever had. Because when you believe the future belongs to you by default, you stop noticing when it starts slipping away. This is where most stories get it wrong. People say Intel failed because it missed mobile, or because AMD caught up, or because NVIDIA stole the AI spotlight. Those are symptoms. The real mistake was far more dangerous and far more invisible. Intel believed its dominance was permanent. For decades, Intel lived by one assumption. If we control manufacturing, we control the future. And for a long time, that belief was correct. Intel didn't just design chips, it built them, in its own fabs, on its own process nodes, with a level of vertical integration no competitor could match. That model created arrogance disguised as confidence, and the industry began shifting toward mobile, toward ARM, toward outsourced manufacturing. Intel didn't panic. It dismissed the change. Smartphones? Too low margin. Outsourced fabs? A weakness, not a strategy. Graphics and accelerators? Secondary products? Intel kept optimizing for a world that no longer existed. Then came the fatal assumption. We can fix this later. Manufacturing delays stacked up. 10 nanometers slipped, then slipped again, and again. For the first time in its history, Intel was behind not just competitors, but the entire industry. Yet leadership doubled down. Instead of questioning the model, Intel reinforced it. More fabs, more capital spending, more promises. The strategy had a name. Reclaim process leadership at all costs. But the cost was time. And time was the one resource Intel no longer had. While Intel fought physics, its rivals rewrote the rules. AMD abandoned the burden of manufacturing and moved faster. NVIDIA stopped selling chips and started selling platforms. TSMC became the real power broker of the semiconductor world. Intel, meanwhile, was trapped, too big to pivot, too proud to retreat, and too slow to catch up. This wasn't one bad decision. It was a belief system. A belief that yesterday's dominance guaranteed tomorrow's relevance. Then by the time Intel realized the future no longer needed its factories, the damage was already irreversible. Everything that followed, the losses, the layoffs, the public humiliation, came from this single, silent mistake. The backlash didn't come from angry consumers. There were no boycotts, no protests, no viral apology videos. What Intel faced was worse. The industry stopped believing. Analysts who once treated Intel's roadmap as gospel began questioning every promise. Delays that would have been excused a decade earlier were now dissected in public. Earnings calls turned hostile. Every sentence from management was met with skepticism. And then came the humiliation Intel couldn't control. While the world exploded into an AI frenzy, Intel was barely mentioned. Data centers were being rebuilt around accelerators Intel didn't dominate. Developers talked about CUDA, not x86. Investors chased companies riding the AI wave, and Intel wasn't one of them. The narrative flipped almost overnight. Intel wasn't the company shaping the future anymore. It was the company trying to catch it. Tech media began asking uncomfortable questions. Why does Intel spend more than anyone, yet innovate slower? Why do rivals move faster with fewer resources? Why does every turnaround plan sound like the last one? Inside the industry, the shift was brutal. Partners quietly diversified away. Customers stopped waiting. Its talent started leaving, not because Intel was failing, but because it no longer felt inevitable. Once, working at Intel meant you were building the future. Now it felt like you were defending the past. That loss of confidence, that silent vote of no confidence from the market, did more damage than any missed product launch ever could. Intel was still massive, still influential, still alive, but the aura was gone. And in Silicon Valley, when belief disappears, collapse is no longer a question of if only when. At some point, every great story stops being emotional and becomes mathematical. And for Intel, the numbers are merciless. At its peak, Intel was one of the most profitable companies in Silicon Valley. Decades of dominance translated into massive margins, predictable growth, and near total control of the PC processor market. Then the decline began to show up on balance sheets. Revenue that once climbed steadily began to stagnate, then fall. Margins shrank as manufacturing costs exploded. Capital expenditures ballooned into the tens of billions, while returns failed to follow. By the mid-2020s, Intel was spending more money than ever, and earning less than it had in years. Market share told an even harsher story. In CPUs, Intel's grip weakened as competitors carved out territory Intel once treated as untouchable. In data centers historically, Intel's profit engine growth slowed just as demand for compute power surged globally. And in the most important market of the decade, AI accelerators, Intel wasn't losing. It was irrelevant. Wall Street noticed. Intel's valuation collapsed relative to its peers. While rivals were rewarded for growth, Intel was punished for promises. Each new turnaround plan was met with doubt instead of optimism. Then came the layoffs. Tens of thousands of employees were cut in waves, not as a temporary correction, but as a structural reset. Entire teams disappeared. Projects were shelved, morale cratered. This wasn't a short-term downturn. It was the financial signature of a broken model. Intel was no longer a company converting scale into dominance. It was a company converting scale into cost. And the most brutal part? All of this happened during one of the most profitable periods in semiconductor history. While the industry thrived, Intel bled. That is how you know this wasn't bad luck. It was failure, quantified. To understand why Intel collapsed while the rest of the semiconductor industry thrived, you have to look beyond products and into structure. This was not a technology problem. It was a strategy trap. First, strategic blindness. Intel optimized for manufacturing leadership in a world that no longer rewarded it. While competitors decoupled design from production to gain speed, Intel doubled down on owning everything. Vertical integration, once a weapon, became a weight. Every delay rippled through the entire company. Second, the platform failure. The AI revolution was never about raw silicon. It was about ecosystems. Software developer lock-in. Intel kept selling components while others sold environments. By the time Intel reacted, the platforms were already entrenched. Third, cultural inertia. Inside Intel, success had lasted too long. Processes were built for predictability, not disruption. Decision-making slowed. Risk aversion replaced experimentation. By the time leadership acknowledged the crisis, the organization was structurally incapable of moving fast. Fourth, leadership timing. Intel's turnaround efforts addressed real problems, but years too late. Correct diagnoses don't matter if the patient has already lost the market. Promises sounded bold, but the industry had heard them before. Finally, the cost trap. Intel's massive scale locked it into enormous fixed expenses. Jobs couldn't be paused. This couldn't be reversed. Every strategic mistake became exponentially more expensive than it would have been for a smaller, nimbler rival. This is the paradox that destroyed Intel. The very qualities that built the empire's scale, control, discipline, became the reasons it couldn't survive the next era. Intel didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it was too powerful to change in time. When a company this large starts to fail, the damage never stays on spreadsheets. It moves upstairs. Inside Intel, the pressure became unbearable. Board meetings turned tense. Earnings calls sounded defensive. Every delay, every missed target, every revised forecast tightened the circle around leadership. The promises were ambitious. Turnarounds always are. Reclaim process leadership. Rebuild manufacturing dominance. Transform Intel into a world-class foundry. But the market stopped listening. As losses mounted, cost-cutting replaced confidence. Mass layoffs followed, not quietly, but in waves large enough to shake the entire organization. Veteran engineers left. Entire teams were dissolved. Decades of institutional knowledge walked out the door. Internally, morale collapsed faster than revenue. Engineers who once believed they were shaping the future now felt trapped inside endless restructuring plans. Managers stopped taking risks. Innovation slowed even further, exactly when speed mattered most, and leadership had nowhere to hide. No single executive could be blamed. No single decision could be reversed. The failure was collective, systemic, and irreversible in the short term. This is the cruel reality of corporate disasters. By the time leaders admit the scale of the problem, their power is already gone. Not through firings, not through scandals, but through the quiet loss of credibility inside the company and outside it. Intel still had leaders, but leadership, in the strategic sense, had already slipped away. There is a reason Intel feels so unsettling as a story, because this wasn't a reckless startup. This wasn't fraud. This wasn't incompetence. This was a great company doing reasonable things and still losing everything that mattered. The first lesson is brutal. Past dominance does not translate into future relevance. Intel believed leadership was something you could defend. The market proved it is something you must continuously re-earn. The second lesson is about focus. Intel tried to win the next era using tools from the previous one. Manufacturing excellence built the PC age. But the AI age rewards ecosystems, software, gravity, and speed. Intel optimized what it was good at instead of what the future demanded. The third lesson is cultural, and it is the most dangerous. When success lasts long enough, it rewires decision-making. Risk feels unnecessary. Disruption feels optional. By the time urgency becomes obvious, the organization is no longer built to respond to it. And finally, the hardest truth of all. Scale magnifies mistakes. Every delay costs more. Every wrong bet becomes harder to reverse. Every strategic error compounds not linearly, but exponentially. Intel didn't betray its customers, didn't insult its market. It simply misunderstood the moment it was living in. And in technology, misunderstanding the moment is fatal, because the future does not wait for legacy. The story of Intel is not over. But it is no longer the story Intel wanted to tell. This is what makes this collapse so uncomfortable to watch. There was no villain, no scandal, no single moment where everything snapped, just a world that moved faster than a giant could turn. Intel may survive, may even recover, but it will never again be the company that decides the future by default. And that should worry every dominant business watching this story unfold, because if the architect of the digital age can lose its place in history, no empire is safe. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Intel still has a real path back to leadership, or has the industry already moved on for good? If you want more deep dives into the rise and fall of corporate giants, subscribe to Empire Saga, and tell us in the comments, which empire should we dissect next?